Hey, tonight I'm going to be reading some scary stories that I found online. I will put in the description where I found them and what they're called. So if you want to choose your favorite, you can. If you want to look them up, you can. Alright, so the very first one is called Chirp. I'll be starting with shorter ones and working towards longer ones. When my friend was 11 or 12, she went to an all-inclusive resort with her family. This was one of those big places with several pools, restaurants, kid areas, etc. Her dad buys walkie-talkies, one for her and her brother, one for the adults, because this was before cell phones were a big thing. That way they can stay in touch if the kids want to do their own thing. One night, her parents and her brother go down to the restaurant for supper. My friend isn't feeling well, so she asks to stay in the hotel room and watch a movie. They say yes and give her the walkie-talkie for emergencies. So she's up there for an hour or so, checking in periodically with her dad, just to say hi, see what they're eating, whatever. She starts to feel really sick, and she says to her dad, "Hey, when will you be back to the room?" Her dad answers, "We're coming up right now. Sweetie, I forgot the room number. Could you tell me what it is?" As soon as she's about to answer, her dad's voice cuts in, "Hey, Chirp, we're coming up right now. We brought you some cake. See you soon." She knows the second one is her dad because he always calls her Chirp. She locks the door. When her parents get back, they say that they haven't talked to her all night. It's scary. This one is called The Dead of Winter. Not mine, but here's an old family story that comes by way of my late great-grandmother, a hardy, rural Yugoslavian woman, if there ever was one. Back in the old country, a family member had died. It was the dead of winter, and family had gathered for the funeral. They'd conducted a nice service, and in the evening had all retired to the home they were staying at in the village. You have to understand, these are small, rural, Eastern European villages. There are like 30 residents to this day I've visited. Anyway, it was snowing heavily, and the wind was howling as the mourners drank and shared memories of the deceased. All of a sudden, someone near the window heard knocking and went to investigate. Upon looking outside, the unlucky mourner was greeted by the apparition of the deceased woman they'd buried earlier that day, knocking on the window and door. Everyone inside was terrified and remained huddled inside until it all seemed to stop. The next morning, someone went outside to have a look around. The body of the dead woman was laying in the snow under the window, frozen solid. She'd been accidentally buried alive. She made her way out of the grave and back home, only to freeze to death, pleading to be let inside, because everyone thought she was a ghost. My great-grandma was in attendance as a little girl and swore this was true until she died. Not a ghost story, but horrifying nonetheless. This next one is called, Was It a Rejection? A few years ago, I was getting ready to move from Cleveland, Ohio to Columbus. A week before my move, I went out of town with a friend. We stayed for a weekend and drove back the following Monday. The drive was long, we were both hungover, and I could envision only getting to my own car, inhaling some fries, and sprawling on my couch. Plus, my roommate had already moved out. So when I got home, it was just going to be me and my cat Harley. I was ready. So sure enough, my friend dropped me off in my car that Monday evening. I drove down the street to McDonald's for some fries and a shake, and then I was finally home. When I opened the front door, Harley was right there, waiting, like she usually does when she hears my key in the lock. But as I walked in that night, she was crying, making this horrific noise she usually doesn't make. Normally when I get home, Harley chirps a little, but this was a mewling that sounded painful, so I knew something was up. Of course, I asked her, "What's wrong, girl?" And then I looked around. That's when I noticed the TV I had in the living room was gone. So I ran up the stairs to my bedroom and saw that that TV was gone too. I ran back down the stairs and called my roommate, asking if she had decided to borrow the TVs for the weekend, which I knew was super unlikely, but I was trying to figure it out. Of course, she said no, and then said that she'd come over because obviously someone had broken in. I called another friend who had helped watch Harley while I was gone. He too said that there had been TVs there all weekend, but that he hadn't been to the house since Sunday night. So I went outside, sweating, realizing that I might not be alone in the house. I was afraid to go near the basement or my roommate's empty room. I called the police. I called my landlord. Everyone converged on the house. It was only when the police were there that I went into the backyard and discovered that our kitchen window had been expertly removed. The window was propped up against our recycling bin, which was on its side. The police asked me if I had any idea who would want my TVs, and some other objects we discovered were missing, but the TVs were the most glaring items. I couldn't think of anyone. My landlord kept asking if I had any exes that I had pissed off, which I thought was weird, and I insisted that there wasn't even an ex, much less an angry one. He asked at one point, not even a dude you rejected at a bar, to which I asked how a guy I had rejected would know where I lived. With all the paperwork filed, the police said that a detective would come by in the morning to fingerprint the window and some other areas of the house. They advised me not to stay in the house that night, given that sometimes repeats happen. They also told my landlord not to touch the window itself, but that he could board the window opening with plywood temporarily. The police said that everything in the backyard needed to stay exactly as it was. I asked if my landlord wanted me to stay while he boarded the window, and he said no and told me to go stay with my roommate for the night. I slept but was unsettled. The next morning, I met the detective at the house. When we got to the backyard, the whole scene had been rearranged. The recycling bin had been moved across the yard, the window was flipped, items that had been scattered from our kitchen in the backyard were thrown away. I told the detective, who kind of shrugged it off, and then he took fingerprints from the window as well as some furniture in the house. Everything had either been wiped down or touched by someone wearing gloves. He couldn't get any evidence from anything in the house or what was left in the backyard. After he left, I called the police department again, as I was still concerned that the scene had been rearranged. The police chief ended up on the phone with me. He told me to never be at the house alone. It seemed someone might not be done with me, and since I was moving anyway, that was easy enough. A friend with a pit bull sat with me the rest of the week while I packed. Harley and I stayed with my old roommate every night. I got a tattoo, I had a going away party, I left the house behind. While I was driving to Columbus, though, I couldn't stop thinking about the break-in and the fact that someone had come back. It had been so clean, no broken windows, no broken locks, nothing. And then I remembered somehow that just after we moved into the house over a year before, my roommate and I had run into our landlord while we were out. We had said hi and moved on, but he kept texting me, trying to get us to a different bar. We never met up with him that night and never saw him out again. He's the only person I rejected who also knew where I lived. And the last story is called Natalie's Dad. I think it's pretty creepy. This is a little more creepy or disturbing than scary, but it's something that still gives me chills when I think about it, and I try not to think about it very often. Note, all names have been changed. From about 5th to 9th grade, my best friend Natalie and I were pretty much inseparable. We lived only a few streets away from each other in an idyllic little town in the Midwest, the kind of place that feels like living in a time capsule of the 1950s. Charming houses with beautifully kept gardens, huge old maple and oak trees lining every street, neighbors who actually stop and greet each other as they walk their dogs or mow their lawns, summer block parties, kids playing in the street until dinner time. That sort of thing. Natalie and I used to walk to and from school together every day, and I often stayed over at her house for an hour or two after school while my parents were still at work. I loved hanging out at her place because her mom was the sweetest person ever. She'd serve us delicious snacks, we'd tell her all about the latest middle school drama, and she'd even let us watch a TV show or play a computer game before we started our homework. Natalie's dad worked a lot and wasn't around often, but whenever I did interact with him, something about him seemed kinda off. On a superficial level, he was perfectly nice and friendly, even funny. He had a good sense of humor, and he was always joking around with Natalie and me and the rest of our friends on the few occasions he was around. But even though I didn't sense a single bit of discomfort from any of my close friends, I couldn't help feeling uneasy in his presence. For one thing, he was too touchy-feely. It was subtle, but I was always noticing it in little ways that made me slightly uncomfortable. Quick example. One weekend, he took me and Natalie and 2 of our friends to a cider mill. We picked apples, drank cider, and went on a hay ride. When the ride was over, Natalie's dad was helping each of us off the side of the wagon, and I was last in line. Something about the way he grabbed my friends by the waist and let his hands linger just a touch too long once they were safely on the ground started to weird me out. When it was my turn then, I quickly jumped off the wagon before he could reach me. He looked a little bewildered, but he didn't say anything. Anyway, fast forward to Natalie's 12th birthday party. She had a sleepover with about 10 girls. We arranged our sleeping bags on the floor of her living room since it was the biggest room in the house. The living room wasn't really closed off by any doors. It had a big opening that connected it seamlessly with the foyer front hallway of the house. I was sleeping near that hallway, which I wasn't pleased about because I preferred to sleep surrounded by people whenever I went to sleepovers. I've always been super afraid of the dark, and I liked having that protection, as silly as it sounds. In the middle of the night, I'm awoken by a hand pressing on my arm. I didn't jolt awake or anything, but I opened my eyes and turned my head to survey my fellow partygoers. They were all dead asleep, some even lightly snoring. Suddenly, I heard quiet giggling behind me. Still lying down and now officially frightened, I quickly turned my body to face the foyer. The opening in the wall that connected the living room and the foyer was a big, sweeping arch. On the right side of the arch, I could just barely see the top of a man's head peeking out from behind the wall, only about 3 feet from the ground. Then I noticed his fingertips splayed out on the wooden floor. He was crouching. It was Natalie's dad. I froze. I honestly had no idea what to do. Was he just kidding around? Didn't it occur to him how creepy this was? Do I say something or do I just awkwardly ignore it and try to fall back asleep? Being my timid, non-confrontational preteen self, I decided to go the latter route. So I turned back on my other side, scooted in as close as I could to my friend sleeping next to me, and somehow managed to fall back asleep despite being obviously and understandably petrified. I'm not sure how long it was before I woke up again, this time by firm tapping on my temple. Knowing who it was this time around, I tried my best not to indicate that I was awake, struggling to keep my eyes closed and my breathing slow and deep. Again, I heard that same stifled giggling. The sound was particularly disturbing because it was almost manic, like he thought this whole routine was absolutely hilarious and could barely contain himself. Even though it was coming from a grown man, it had all the giddiness of a 5-year-old playing hide-and-go-seek with his older siblings. Yet again, I had no idea what to do. I wasn't sure if he wanted me to acknowledge him or what, so I turned to face the foyer again and just barely caught a glimpse of his head and fingers disappearing behind the wall in that same crouched position. More giggling. I quickly turned back and scooted even closer to my sleeping friend, partially waking her and causing her to shift around a bit. I hoped she would wake up completely, but she just turned over and drifted off. As I pulled my sleeping bag tighter over my shoulders, I heard what sounded like someone shuffling on all fours down the hallway. I don't remember how I got back to sleep that night, but somehow I did, and morning finally, mercifully arrived. Natalie's parents made us all pancakes, and her dad was acting completely normal. He didn't pay any particular attention to me, but he didn't make a point to ignore me either. He just interacted with me like he did with everyone else, joking around and smiling. A couple months later, Natalie had another sleepover. This time I made sure to secure a sleeping spot in the exact center of everyone, far from the front hallway. But later that night, I abruptly woke up in the middle of a deep sleep for seemingly no reason. I had been sleeping on my back and just suddenly opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling, wide awake. Almost instantly, I was overcome with the most intense feeling of dread that I have ever experienced. I felt like I couldn't move my limbs, like some invisible weighted blanket was holding my body down. Even though I know I shouldn't, I slowly turned my head towards the front hallway. As my eyes adjusted in the darkness, I could see Natalie's mom and dad standing in the entryway, looking directly at me with the most angry, hateful expressions on their faces. They were positioned awkwardly far from each other, about 2 feet of space between them, with their arms stiff and straight at their sides. Even though they were a fair distance away from me, I'll never forget how disturbing their faces looked, contorted into a pure rage that only seemed to grow in intensity the longer I allowed myself to look. Their eyes kept narrowing, and they were showing all their teeth the way a threatened dog would, gritting them so tightly I thought their jaws would crack. After staring frozen for a good few seconds, I finally felt like I could move my arms and legs again. I turned away from them and pulled my sleeping bag high up over my head, shaking. I barely slept the rest of the night, and I never heard any noise or movement from the hallway after that. The next morning, it was all homemade pancakes and warm smiles and utter normalcy yet again. I never told Natalie about any of this, as I was pretty sure she would think I was either crazy or trying to prank her. Our friendship faded a few years later anyway, which coincidentally was right around the time that her parents got divorced. Recently, Natalie and her parents' divorce came up in conversation with my mom, who had told me about a comment Natalie's mom made to her a few years ago. Back when Natalie and I were still super close, we had actually taken a few small road trip vacations together with our moms. And I guess at some point on one of those trips, our moms were gossiping about a particularly wealthy and impossibly perfect family that lived in our neighborhood and had a reputation of being somewhat pretentious. Natalie's mom, skeptical about their apparent perfection, said, "Well, in this neighborhood, you never know what goes on behind closed doors." The comment is innocent enough, but for me, it adds an extra layer of creepiness, given what I experienced at her house. I think the parents standing in the foyer was a case of sleep paralysis, but the first crouching scenes in that one scare me, and I had to keep myself from turning around and looking over my shoulder just now. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Let me know what you think. And I hope tonight you sleep super, super well, safe